Good afternoon, and welcome to today's congressional briefing, Undoing Racism by Eliminating Debilitating Criminal Penalties. I am Charles E. Lewis, Jr., and I will be your host and moderator. Today's briefing is being sponsored by the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy and the Center for Social Development at the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. We will be taking a look today at using expungement as a means to undo the perpetual harm to felony offenders, many who have nonviolent convictions, many who have never spent any time in jail or prison, but are prevented from applying for jobs, housing, education, and social services. And we know that Black Americans are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. One particular bill, H.R. 2410, the REDEEM Act, introduced last year by the late Congressman Elijah Cummings, would provide automatic expungement for nonviolent federal felony offenders after 5 years of staying clean. We are pleased to have with us today Congresswoman Karen Bass, an original co-sponsor of the bill, to say a few words about the need for expungement. Congresswoman Bass, who represents the 37th Congressional District in California, is a social worker, and we were thrilled when she was considered as a prime candidate for vice president. Thank you, Congresswoman Bass, for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, but also thank you for the work that you're doing. Expungement is a critically important issue, and all of us know how difficult it is for people to get their records expunged. You know, I say that it used to be in our country that if you committed a crime and you did your time, you paid your debt to society, and you were reintegrated back into society. I even remember when I first started college in the early 70s that we had a program where you could matriculate from the state prison to the state college. And now when we decided that punishment was what we wanted to do and not rehabilitation, in a way we sentence people to life. They serve part of their sentence while they're incarcerated. And then for the rest of their lives, they carry around the fact that they have a felony or they have a conviction. And so expunging records, I think, needs to be something that can be automatic, needs to be a very easy process and not the onerous process that it is now. And the REDEEM Act is something that I'm absolutely going to look at. As you mentioned, our esteemed Representative Cummings led the way on that bill in this Congress. And in the next Congress, under a Biden-Harris administration, I am going to keep my fingers crossed that we will be able to get a lot done in regarding to criminal justice reform. There's things that we need to fix in the First Step Act. The assessment tool that uses the algorithm to decide who's at risk and who isn't, we know is biased, we know is problematic, and that needs to be changed. And we absolutely need a way for people to redeem themselves, for people to be reintegrated back into society. I just want to end on the note that we had a hearing today in the crime subcommittee that focused on COVID, because I have been very concerned from day one when we realized it was a pandemic. Everybody in society seemed to understand nursing homes, but didn't understand prisons. And we know that thousands of prisoners have taken ill, many have died, and many of the staff, the guards, have died as well. And so we want to make sure that the Bureau of Prisons releases people, and when they are released, they need to be helped. One last thing I want to mention. I have a bill that creates a one-stop center for people who are formerly incarcerated. And I want the funding to go to people who are formerly incarcerated to start reentry centers so that people can be reintegrated back into their communities and assisted with expungement, assisted with getting with their ID, driver's license, and employment. So thank you for what you do. I look forward to working with you in the next Congress, and I look forward to seeing the REDEEM Act move forward.
Thank you, Congresswoman Bass, for joining us today. We have 4 outstanding panelists for today's briefing who have been working on the behalf of incarcerated individuals and families for decades. The briefing will consist of presentations by the four panelists, followed by a question and answer session. So please type your questions in the YouTube comments section during the briefing, and we'll get to as many as we can. You can also email comments to info@crispinc.org, info@crispinc.org. This event is being recorded and will be available on YouTube after its conclusion. The views expressed by our panelists are solely their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the sponsoring organizations. Our first panelist will be Dr. Carrie Pettis Davis, an associate professor at Florida State University College of Social Work and the founding director of the Institute for Justice Research and Development. She is one of social work's leading experts in criminal justice and decarceration. Carrie's research was instrumental in conceptualizing and passing the First Step Act. You can read more of her bio and the other panelists on the CRISP website. Following Carrie will be Cedric R. Hendricks, Associate Director at the Court Services and Offender Supervision Agency, known commonly as CSOSA. He leads the agency's Office of Legislative, Intergovernmental, and Public Affairs. A former Hill staffer for Congressman John Conyers and legislative director for Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, Cedric is an adjunct professor at the University of the District of Columbia Department of Social Work. Following Cedric will be Attorney Margaret Love, known as the Pardon Attorney, because she served as the United States Pardon Attorney in the Justice Department from 1990 to 1997. She is currently the executive director of the Collateral Consequences Resource Center. A prolific author, Margaret regularly consults with legislatures, governors, and other authorities on developing relief from the adverse effects of a criminal record. Our final presenter will be David Mohammed, executive director of the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform. He also serves as technical assistance provider for the Sierra Health Foundation's Positive Youth Initiative, providing training and consulting to several California probation departments. David has worked in several high-level probation jobs, including Chief Probation Officer of Alameda County, California, Deputy Commissioner of the New York City Department of Probation, and Chief of Committed Services for Washington, D.C.'s Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services. Before I bring on our panelists, this is an extremely important issue for me. I worked for nearly a decade at a church in Brooklyn with hundreds of African-American men who had been incarcerated or otherwise involved in the criminal justice system. Having a felony wrecked many of their lives. This would later become the focus of my doctoral studies and dissertation. It is estimated that 8% of adult Americans have a felony conviction, somewhere in the range of 24 million Americans. A third, 33% of African American males have felony convictions. Less than half of people with felony convictions serve time in jail or prison, but many pay the same penalties: lack of access to jobs, access to housing, and social support. It is estimated that more than 5 million Americans could not vote in the 2020 elections due to a criminal conviction. One in 16 African Americans of voting age are ineligible to vote, 4 times the general population. HR 2410, which is one act, the REDEEM Act, provides relief for nonviolent federal felony offenders. The federal prison system accounts for just 12% of prisoners in the United States. And this seems like a drop in the bucket, but it's a start. and would bring relief to tens of thousands of individuals and their families. I will close by reading a passage from Michelle Alexander's blockbuster book, The New Jim Crow. She writes about how historians will look back on mass incarceration. How fascinating, they will likely say, that a drug war was waged almost exclusively against poor people of color, people already trapped in ghettos that lacked jobs and decent schools. They were rounded up by millions, packed away in prisons, and when released, they were stigmatized for life, denied the right to vote, and ushered into a world of discrimination. Legally barred from employment, housing, and welfare benefits, and saddled with thousands of dollars of debt, these people were shamed and condemned for failing to hold their families together. They were chastised for succumbing to depression and anger and blamed for landing back in prison. So when we talk about undoing racism, expungement is a good place to start. We will now hear from our panelists. Carrie?
Oops, I saw that I was muted, sorry. So thank you, what a great introduction, and I'm very honored to be here today. As a researcher, I'm gonna talk to you today about what the data tells us, about what people are experiencing and what opportunities there are to create change. So what we know, and you've heard a bunch of statistics already, so I'll keep those limited, but what we know is about 13 million people cycle in and out of our jails and prisons every year. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the difference between jails and prisons, jails are a place that many people are held pre-trial before they've been convicted. And prisons, and people can be held after conviction in jails too. Prisons are a place for after people have been convicted. Regardless of where people are incarcerated and how long they're incarcerated, as both of our presenters have mentioned, there are lifelong consequences to having a criminal history. And what we know when we look across the country is that right now, incarceration and how we're treating people after they get released from incarceration isn't working. Nationally, about 77% of people who are released from incarceration are returned to incarceration or reincarcerated within 5 years. Some of these people are reincarcerated because they have committed a new crime. But many of these people are reincarcerated because of what is known as technical violations of their supervision after they're released, such as not being able to pay fines or fees associated with supervision because they can't get a job after their incarceration experience. And many times they can't get a job because they have a criminal record that is searchable by just about everyone. And many people, employers still do not feel comfortable hiring people who have criminal records. Our research center, IJRD, does research with hundreds of prisons and jails across multiple states and with thousands of people experiencing release from incarceration. And consistently, despite the community, urban or rural, despite the state, south or a southern state, a western state, a northern state, we find the same barriers to success after incarceration. And we've categorized these barriers into internal barriers that are specific to that individual, such as maybe having a severe mental health issue or a severe substance use disorder. And then also into external barriers. And the external barriers are really what I think is particularly relevant for this conversation today. Because what we've figured out through decades of research are ways in which we can support people and rehabilitate people, to use a term that was used earlier today, after incarceration experience. However, the external barriers that exist in our communities across the country, federally, state, and locally, works against rehabilitative principles. The key rehabilitative principle being that people need to feel and experience conclusions, experience opportunities in their communities. And what happens in practice and policy right now is we have a quilt of 45,000 federal and state policies that explicitly exclude people from opportunities in their communities after having a criminal record, sometimes permanently, sometimes automatically, and they exclude access to employment, they exclude access to housing, they exclude access to education, they exclude access, even in some cases, to family formation or family reunification. And what we know from our rehabilitative principles, if we really want to drive this number, recidivism number down of 77%, we have to have opportunities in our community that are promoted by policy, that allow people to be contributing members of their communities, that allow them access to employment, stable housing, their family, to voting. And these opportunities can be created both at local levels, at private sector levels, and at the federal level. So I just want to make, in the last few minutes, I want to make a few recommendations for consideration that our data suggests could make a big impact on not only reducing the number of people who experience a subsequent incarceration, but also on reducing the stratification in our society that occurs through incarceration because of the disproportionate representation of people of color in the criminal justice system, despite no differences in criminal background, and the disproportionate representation of people in poverty in our criminal justice system. So the first recommendation that I would make is I would suggest, based on the research, that there be a sweeping examination of policies that automatically and without nuance ban people from access to employment, that there be a sweeping examination of policies that ban people from access to viable and stable housing simply because they have a criminal background, and that there be sweeping examinations of policies that negatively impact families. Because although many people talk about individuals with criminal records, what our research also shows is almost 2/3 of those individuals have children under the age of 18. So when their parent returns home and is not allowed access because of a criminal record to employment or stable housing, that child suffers as well. There should also be examination of policies that impact families because of the legislation that was passed more than 2 decades ago that allows permanent severing of parental rights to people while they're incarcerated, despite what's going on in the family situation. And finally, I would suggest that more and more data be created and used in policy decision-making about the disproportionate impact of these policies, particularly on communities of color and poor communities. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the panel and our questions. So Mr. Hendricks, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Well, good evening. I'm Cedric Hendricks. I'm an associate director at the Court Services and Offender Supervision Agency. We generally refer to our agency as CSOSA. Now, CSOSA is responsible for the community supervision of men and women in the District of Columbia that are on probation, parole, or supervised release. Probation, of course, is the thing that people are put on by the court in lieu of a incarceration sentence. And here in DC, parole and supervised release are 2 forms of supervision that occur post-incarceration. So on any given day, we have about 9,500 individuals under our agency supervision, who by and large reside here in the District of Columbia. And it's usually been the case over the years I've been here, and it's almost 20, that half of the individuals that we have under supervision that are employable are unemployed. And frankly, that's not good for public safety. And so over the years I've been here, I've worked hard on reentry and in particular on employment in an effort to try and change that number and get more of our people employed. And what I found is that it really requires engagement with employers to turn no's into yeses. As Carrie indicated, you know, there are barriers, and some businesses have policies that exclude justice-involved individuals from employment. For example, here, of course, in the metropolitan Washington area, the federal government is the largest employer. Well, the federal government has really not been known to hire justice-involved individuals. Another example, Metro, the rapid transit system that does bus and rail here in the District of Columbia. Back in 2011, they promulgated a policy on criminal background checks that basically excluded people with felony convictions from working at Metro. They, prior to that time, had a number of individuals that I know that worked at Metro, but for whatever reason, they implemented a policy change that basically said that if you had, for example, a felony drug possession conviction, anytime during your lifetime, you were permanently disqualified for holding a public contact job at Metro. Now, that was, for me, an astonishing thing to learn about. And what subsequently happened was that the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law brought a lawsuit against Metro over this policy. And ultimately, that matter was settled, and the terms of the settlement essentially resulted in Metro saying that they would suspend that policy for a year. Victory, but a modest one. But that's the kind of barrier that some businesses have erected as a matter of policy that says people with criminal histories don't even think about it. You need not apply. Now, on the other hand, whereas I said that 50% of our employable folks are unemployed, that, of course, indicates that 50% are. And so when you look at where those that are under supervision that are employed are working, it's a lot of places. But by and large, I can point to employment sectors here where the numbers are not good. What we have found is that the hospitality industry and the construction industry have been the industries of great promise for folks under supervision. But needless to say, not everybody under supervision wants to work in hospitality or do construction work. What we've tried to do in both of those arenas have been to build relationships with employers who will say yes rather than no, who accept the fact that the people that we refer are under supervision, have felony histories for the most part. And so they go in knowing that. And that's the approach that we've taken that has had some success, being upfront about the histories and working with employers who are open to providing someone a second chance at employment. And so we have partners in the hotel industry. We've had partners in the restaurant industry in terms of the hospitality sector. And we have partners that are in the construction industry, Miller & Long Construction, which is a major company around here, Clark Construction, Blue Sky Construction in particular is a partner that we worked a lot with of late. And so they look to us to meet their need for employees, or what we are holding ourselves out to be to them and others is a place where you can find the talent you need. Now, on October 1st, in an effort to kind of formalize our employer engagement, we launched an initiative we call Hire One. Hire One. And the idea behind Hire One is that if you hire one of our people under supervision, we have every confidence that you will come back and want to hire another. because you will find, notwithstanding any criminal history they might have, that they have the job skills and the level of commitment to do the job that you're looking for, to meet your need for stable employees. Now, on October 1st, we work with the Society for Human Resource Management, better known as SHRM, the DC chapter specifically, and we did a presentation during their annual meeting. And we had 99 DC SHRM members attend our workshop and express some interest in working with us around the Hire One initiative. We'll be following that up in January with the roundtable, where we're essentially going to reconvene all of those folks and talk about how we can help them meet their specific talent needs. And then, in fact, in February, we'll be working with them to do a job fair where we hope to get some folks matched up with employers willing to hire them. So that is the pathway that we're investing in at the moment. Let me mention one other thing. We also launched around that same time what we call our Credible Messenger Fellowship Initiative. Credible messengers are justice-involved individuals that work at a number of criminal justice agencies. Here in the District of Columbia, the DC Office of the Attorney General uses some of them in its Cure the Streets program. The DC Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services uses Credible Messengers in its community supervision efforts. Well, we brought on board our first Credible Messenger a month ago, and this is, in fact, a justice-involved individual who had previously been under supervision here at CSOSA. And as it happens, this individual had a long history of working with returning citizens in an effort to help them come home and stay home. So he's already a great asset within our agency, and there's already interest being expressed in him by other employers when he leaves us. So fellowships are 6 months in duration. However, during that time, people are federal employees with the opportunity to acquire federal benefits. So it's essentially a launch pad. And we are about to launch a recruitment initiative to bring on board 4 additional Credible Messengers. We felt it important to do this as a federal agency to stand as an example to others in Washington and say to them that if we as a criminal justice agency can bring on board with people with criminal histories, you folks over at Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Education, the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Labor, you can do it too. And so we were able to get the authority to undertake this targeted hiring initiative by working with the Federal Office of Personnel Management because they saw the positive value of this initiative. And as it happens, the current president has been a strong supporter of second chance employment. So we have taken the steps to bring it into reality in the federal government. So those are the 2 things I want to share with you. I'm happy to take questions about them later. And now look forward to turning it over to the next panelist, who I hope is on board now, and that would be Margaret Love.
Yes, we're having a little difficulty getting Margaret situated. So we're going to ask David if he would come on and make his presentation.
Sure. First, thank you all. Thank you, Charles. It's really good seeing you. It's been a number of years since we worked together in DC. We've both been at this for a while. And so glad to join Cedric, who also worked with in DC. Glad to join old friends in this very serious work. So, and really the Center for Social Development for raising this incredibly important issue. So I want to talk about the challenges that we have and some suggestions on how to move forward. The criminal justice system has proven to really be in a whole ineffective, harmful, and excessively expensive. Obviously, I spent many years working inside the system to change that reality with, I believe, many successes. But we also have to acknowledge where we are in terms of the lack of effectiveness, the cause of harm, and the extraordinary expense of the criminal justice system in America. So in addition to the direct costs of the system and the resulting trauma on the individuals, the collateral consequences of incarceration are also very significant. After serving their sentences in jail and prison, the formerly incarcerated continue to face punishments that thwart their ability to really reintegrate back into society, the things that we want them to do successfully. Many formerly incarcerated are barred from living in public housing. They're separated from their family and loved ones who can support them. Many are also barred from receiving food stamps at a time when they don't have food or a job. Many states also bar formerly incarcerated from receiving certain licenses like barbering and nursing. You can be a barber in prison, get out, and be prohibited from legally participating and practicing that profession. This is similar to firefighting in California. Inmates in the state's fire camps perform really heroic firefighting duties, earning, I think, at best $2 a day, which that is seen as some of the highest paying jobs inside. Then when they're released, they're not allowed to work as firefighters. It's nonsensical. There was a recent bill that passed the California legislature that ironically didn't address the core issue here, which is if you were trained to be a firefighter, worked as a firefighter inside, you only can be in that camp as a non-serious or non-violent felony at charge. That when you get out, you should be able to work as a firefighter as you did while an inmate. And so the recent legislation, instead of changing the wrong policy, tried to help individuals to become eligible to overcome the wrong policies by saying people who went through the fire camp and went through these other processes can have expungement, which is great, and obviously what we want to raise here. And so it's an example on how expungement can be this great tool. But I also want to point out, we also have to change these kind of weird things where people can get trained and do the profession inside and can't continue to do that when they get out. One of the most problematic barriers to the formerly incarcerated is being ineligible for federal financial aid to attend college. Education, one of the greatest tools available to help the population become productive and successful. Education is probably the single greatest impact on not just reducing recidivism, but helping folks become successful. It's forbidden for several folks who are inside and even after they come home. Again, further disenfranchising the formerly incarcerated is that in most states, you can't vote based upon either still being under supervision or having ever been convicted of a felony. And it's so varied in the United States, right? So in Vermont, it never goes away. While you're serving a prison sentence, you can vote, versus what had been the case until recently in Florida, which is a permanent lifetime ban for voting. But we see even when it's overturned, which was great that it happened from the voters of Florida, all of these barriers were added to it, really creating a poll tax in Florida for the formerly incarcerated. California recently passed legislation allowing people who are on parole to exercise the franchise, to be able to vote. So punitive and census laws and policies that thus exclude the formerly incarcerated from housing, financial aid, food, education, civic engagement. These are the very supports which are needed to combat these, very high recidivism rates. So a couple of pieces, what we should do and what can Congress do? Obviously, expanding expungement, providing incentives to states to expand expungement, moving beyond just misdemeanors or even low-level felonies. If someone has come home and have been successful and has overcome all of these barriers, they've paid their debt to society, they too should be able to not be barred from employment and education and housing and benefits. So a few additional pieces in terms of the Pell Grant. The Pell Grant should be eligible to everyone who is deserving and not excluded because of a felony conviction, even if you're inside. You heard Congresswoman Bass from California talk about how we used to be able to transfer from the education in prison to directly into university. There's some programs that are helping that, like the Underground Scholars at UC Berkeley, but it's far too often the exception rather than the rule and the norm. Also, federal housing rights and housing discrimination legislation. Right, we should bar discrimination against people with criminal records. That when you are submitting a rental application, your criminal record should not be used to exclude you or to deny you rather from renting an apartment. Obviously there's some things we can consider like sex offenses and whether or not they're children. Even those we've got to have some sensible resolution to. But what we have in many jurisdictions is places that just will bar you from any type of criminal record on a rental application. Also, the federal government in the past has done a good job of clarifying that the HUD does not forbid people who are convicted of crimes from living in public housing, with only two exceptions: registered sex offenders and people who manufactured methamphetamines on public housing, right? So pretty small exclusion. But local housing authorities, local jurisdictions add their own exclusionary policies. And we should have federal legislation that bars local jurisdiction from prohibiting people with criminal records from living in public housing. As well as we should bar states from excluding benefits for people with criminal records. Places like California, where we have something called CalFresh, which is just a nice name for food stamps. And there's been some improvements, but there's still people who are barred in the federal government in terms of drug charges. We should eliminate all the federal restrictions as well as bar states from adding restrictions to receiving benefits that can be incredibly helpful at helping somebody get on their feet when they're coming home from incarceration. So we have a lot of work to do. Thankfully, we have more knowledge about this. We understand why these are barriers that give us the wrong outcomes that we're trying to get, which are reducing recidivism rates, improved outcomes for people coming home from incarceration or people with criminal records, and not making it harder for them to be successful. We are supposed to be making it easier and helping them navigate and helping them achieve success. So let's remove all those barriers to success. And there's a lot that Congress can do to make that happen. Thank you.
And now we're going to hear from Margaret Love.
Hi there. I apologize for being late. It's the fault of my unfortunate broken arm, which I'm dealing with here. I am so glad to be here, though, and so glad to be participating on this panel. I'm going to take a little bit of a different angle here and speak to a subject that's been much in the news, or at least refer to a subject that's been much in the news in recent days, and that is presidential pardons. And particularly how the current controversy over President Trump's use of the pardon power can affect the way Congress and the executive in the next administration deals with this problem of criminal records, particularly federal criminal records. And those are the ones that I have been most interested in my own practice. The fact of it is, states are really doing a pretty darn good job in addressing the problem of criminal records for their own state offenses, whether it's expungement or occupational licensing restrictions or certificates of good conduct, or diversionary dispositions to avoid a conviction in the first place. States have been legislating over the past 3 or 4 years at a very rapid pace. The Collateral Consequences Resource Center that I am the director of identified 154 new laws, separate new laws, just last year, enacted in the states to deal with problems of criminal records and helping people regain their status in the community and their legal rights after the conviction. However, Congress has not done quite as well. And so federal offenders are left with very little by way of legal relief to overcome their conviction record. And that's where pardons come in, because historically, the only relief that most people with a federal criminal record have is, in fact, a presidential pardon. There are some very interesting bills currently pending in Congress that would go some way towards supplementing or replacing even the pardon as the sole relief for federal offenders. And for this reason, I've said frequently in recent days that I really regard all this controversy over President Trump's pardons as a kind of a unintended gift to us, because it'll make us think about why we have piled up such a huge backlog of cases in the pardon process. It is a pardon process that President Trump has not availed himself of at all, so that there are almost 3,000 applicants for presidential pardons pending in the Justice Department. Many, many more prisoner petitions for commutation of sentence, something north of 11,000 pending. So whatever President Trump does in these last weeks of his administration, probably the problem of an overburdened, overloaded pardon system is going to remain for the new administration. And this is where I really hope we can make some terrific progress. We've had a lot of bipartisan buy-in to dealing with criminal records issues. It's been one of the few areas that both Republicans and Democrats have been able to join forces on. That saw this earlier this year with the CARES Act and the pandemic financing, where the Small Business Administration was barring people with a criminal record from small business loans. That's crazy, since an awful lot of people come out of prison or who have records have their own businesses. So barring those people from small business loans had a very, very counterproductive and major effect. Now, Congress got together and in a bipartisan fashion, sort of strong-armed the administration and made the Secretary of the Treasury change the SBA rules. I believe that this spirit of bipartisan cooperation in criminal justice reform will extend into the new administration. And I'll mention just a couple of pending bills. They'll have to be reintroduced, but Senator Whitehouse and Senator Cornyn together, a Republican and a Democrat, reverse order, have introduced a bill that would authorize federal courts to issue certificates of rehabilitation. There is a bill that would provide for sealing or expungement of drug crimes and non-conviction records. Even an arrest record can dog you and result in losing opportunities and benefits. The Business Roundtable published a very extensive second chance agenda, and one of the things that they recommended was for Congress to expand the Federal First Offender Act, which currently applies only to drug possession. It's a very narrow law, but it provides deferred adjudication and an opportunity to avoid a felony conviction record. And if we could expand that statute to deal with anybody who has no prior felony record, we could make tremendous progress in steering people out of the system. So I believe that the gift, I would call it, of President Trump's final pardons is really going to extend into the new administration and encourage us to look beyond pardoning, to question whether perhaps we have not put too much burden on the president's pardon power. We have relied on it too much. We need to develop ways to reroute some of that business into the federal courts. Whether it's, we've already done it for federal prisoners in the First Step Act. So now they can go back to court and get their sentence reduced. But now we need to do it for people who have left their conviction behind them, or who would like to leave it behind them, who have left their prison sentence behind them, and who need to overcome the adverse effects of a criminal record. And this is where I think there are tremendous opportunities for the new administration to work in a bipartisan fashion with leaders in Congress like Senator Whitehouse, like Senator Clinton, and work toward developing a broad array, not just expungement, but certificates, diversion, all kinds of different opportunities to enable people who have had an adverse encounter with the justice system to get back on their feet and regain their full rights of citizenship. So that's what I'm hopeful for, and it's a pleasure to be able to introduce that thought into this conversation.
Thank you, Margaret. And I'd like to bring our panelists, all of our panelists, back on camera. Obviously, this whole issue of mass incarceration is huge. All right, it's almost like where do we begin to address this? And expungement is just one avenue of doing it. But before I go there, I want to throw out this question primarily to Carrie, because she is the researcher among us. But anybody else can respond to this as well. Where are we lacking research? Where are the gaps? Where do we need to focus some of our research? And I have a second part of the question, because I know that research requires money, it requires funding, and obviously the federal government is not going to be in any condition after these bailouts and relief bills. So we got to convince the private sector that they need to address this issue. So how do we begin building up more research in this area?
Yeah, so I could talk for a long time about that, but I'm gonna highlight 2 or 3 areas. Is one, we really need to systematically document the impact of these collateral consequence policies on people's lives and the effectiveness of collateral consequence reforms. So although there's been many new collateral consequences policies adopted, almost every state in the country has reformed collateral consequences policies in the past 2 years. But what we have very little research on is showing how consistent and how detrimental these policies are that exclude people to access to education and employment, housing stability, families. The other piece that we need to acknowledge in doing this documentation is that currently the way that we conceptualize and measure and report recidivism is flawed. So recidivism is described as a failed individual behavior, that the individual has done something wrong. But in fact, what recidivism reflects is a failure in our systems and a failure in our policies and limited opportunities combined with individual behavior. So we need to start to tease some of that out. And then the final piece that I would say is that we need to stop talking about I'm going to try not to use a research term, but I'm going to start with a research term. We need to stop talking about equity as this independent variable, right? Like, how do people experience the criminal justice system differently by race or poverty? We've got a lot of documentation, a lot of empirical evidence that shows that there's extreme disproportionality. What we need to start looking at is how our reforms promote equity and whether they achieve equity or do they make it worse. Because historically, we've found that many of our reforms have actually made things worse from an equity perspective.
Anybody else want to weigh in on this issue? Research, what do we need?
Sure, I'd be happy to weigh in. There are two areas to add to what Carrie just said that interest me a lot. One is the effect of diverting people out of the criminal justice system through deferred dispositions to enable people to avoid a conviction record. And actually, you mentioned mass incarceration, Charles. I would say it's really mass conviction that is the problem, because most people don't go to prison. Right. They pick up a criminal record, they don't go to prison, but there they are with either a felony conviction or even just an arrest record. There's a very interesting study, Carrie, you probably know of it, out of Harris County, Texas, where two economists studied cohorts of people who were given deferred adjudication. And what that means is that you're allowed to plead guilty, but there's no sentence imposed. So there's no judgment and no conviction. And you're put on probation for a period of time. And if you can succeed on probation, you come back to the court and all of the charges are dismissed and the record is sealed. Now, that was found by these two economists to have tremendously beneficial effects, both short and long term, particularly for young Black men who had no prior felony conviction. And apparently the incentive to avoid that first felony conviction was such that they had great success with these programs. I'd like to see more of these programs studied because there are only two studies that I know of. The other area that I'd like to see studied is some of the effect of these amazing occupational licensing reforms. The Institute for Justice, which is a libertarian public interest law firm, has been at the forefront of pushing occupational licensing boards to do away with these good moral character standards and start looking at whether someone can actually do the job. They've done a tremendous job in persuading many states, some of them quite conservative, to reel in the power of occupational licensing boards to refuse to license people just because they have a criminal record. Some of these new laws have research data sources built into them, requiring reporting requirements from the licensing boards. I'd like to see how it's working and how many people get licensed under the new standards, and whether this introduces them to a much higher income and sort of a road to the middle class, if you will. That's a little corny, but still. So those two areas I'd really like to see studied.
And I just say, I know we want to get to other questions. I just say, this has come up, much better study around gun violence. Obviously, the CDC has been barred from doing that type of research. It's been let up a little bit, but it didn't happen. And so hope in this new administration, there can be a lot better federal funding of gun violence research.
Cedric, so how do you guys document the success of what you're doing? What works in EXPUNGEMENT?
I had to undo my mute button. But look, for me, it's an employer that says yes rather than no. And as I mentioned earlier, it's been long the case that 50% of our employable folks are unemployed. And I want to change that number. And that's why, you know, our focus is on talking to employers. You know, the things that they express interest in and concern about are these things. Do your folks have the skills that I need for the positions I have open? And two, what is the level of risk associated with bringing them into my workforce? You see. And so, you know, if you think about CSOSA as a supervision agency, and David, you know this from your days at DYRS, we're a risk management business of sorts. And while we can't guarantee good behavior, we certainly work hard to promote it and support employers that are willing to work with us, so that if there are any concerns or issues that manifest during the tenure of one of our people on their workforce, you know, we stand behind them and we're there to help sort things out. So for me, it's kind of that ground level engagement. You know, I mean, we're talking to employers day in and day out, you know, and some, you know, don't want to hear it, but more and more I'm finding some willing to. And I think, you know, what Margaret talked about earlier, the kind of bipartisan dialogue around criminal justice reform has been helpful, but that's almost like inside baseball. You know, we know about that because we live it. But you know, you go down to the general manager of the, you know, Starbucks on the corner, they don't know nothing about it or care. You know, but when we knock on the door and say, well, you know, we're at CSOSA and we're less than our office is 100 yards away from your front door, and we have people who need employment, and I see you got a "we're hiring" sign on your door. Can we work together to make this happen? You have a need, we have people with a need, let's figure it out. So, you know, what would be, I think, helpful to us in a broader way is to have our government officials. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, it was helpful to have President Trump talk about second chances. You know, they the last couple of years had Second Chance Month celebrations in April. And at the district government level, there have been a number of things that the local government has done. For example, and David, I think you were gone after this happened, but in 2011, Phil Mendelssohn pushed a bill out that provided employers liability protection, such that if you did your due diligence in bringing someone on board, you know, you made sure that their criminal history didn't conflict with the nature of the work and, you know, all of that array of things. Then if you got hit with a negligent hiring suit because of something that somebody did, the district government would step in and provide inoculation protection to you. Now, that's one of the best kept secrets in town. Right. That's on the books. Nobody talks about it, but, you know, those of us who play inside baseball know about it. You know that we did Band-a-Box here. We did Band-a-Box housing here. And those things are helpful. But, you know, there still is a tremendous need for educating the business community about them. You know, we've worked with the Chamber of Commerce, any and everybody. I mentioned DC Sherm earlier, and we're making small headway because, you know, I mean, every month we find, you know, there's one more employer that steps up and says, okay, I'm willing to partner with you. And partnering is really what we're after, so that we have a working relationship where we can send not just one, but send another and another. And it ties into my hire one concept. You know, now proudly we can say at CSOSA, we've hired one. In fact, we've hired more than one.
So let me ask. Let's talk about, does expungement work in a sense? I mean, there are those, if I put on my devil advocate's hat, they will say that the public has a right to know who the criminals are. All right, but does it provide an incentive for the person who gets relief to you know, to want to stay out of the system?
And what
our approach is just to be upfront about it. You got a record, you know, you can't walk away from it. Expungement, record sealing are extremely controversial. You know, there are a handful of bills pending before the city council here in the District of Columbia. The mayor's got one, at least 4 council members got bills too. Today is really the last of 2 legislative sessions. They didn't act on those bills today. And now, I guess for the 3rd year, they're all dying. And it's because there's controversy that shroud them. The business community doesn't like them. The prosecutorial community does not like them. And, and until that all gets sorted out, it's not going to happen, even with what I would consider the progressive legislative body that we have here in the city. So in the meantime, because day in and day out, I'm sitting across from somebody who has a job in a place. And you said, you're talking all that yak about reentry and whatnot, but Mr. Muhammad, can you get me a job and a place to stay today? I'm getting out of Federal City Recovery today. I'm getting out of Fairview Halfway House today. I'm getting out of Be It Gone Forever Hope Village today. And if you can't say yes, you say, well, I'm going to a meeting. I'll talk to, that's where the rubber meets the road. So for me, I'm knocking on employers' doors saying, I've got some folk that can meet your need. I see that help wanted sign on your door. Let's figure out how we can work together.
So, Cedric, I really love your passion about all of this. But at the end of the day, there has to be policies, right, that we put in place in order to get some of the things that you want to do. It's not just somebody's going to say, I can give you a job, all right? It's got to be some kind of overall strategy to make things work. And you were about to say something, David?
Yeah, so, I think that your question in terms of an incentive or providing encouragement for folks to achieve certain milestones, I think that is incredibly important because
everybody's not speaking.
I think Charles, I think that's yours actually. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
So I think when we're talking about providing incentives, providing encouragement, I think these type of certificates of rehabilitation, certificates of completion, all of these things, some of states have them and they don't mean anything. And some, they mean something in terms of licensing and being able to receive certain benefits. So I think expungement is incredibly important. Unfortunately, it'll never go away because this thing called Google. But in terms of eligibility of your being able to receive certain licenses and be able to benefit from certain pieces that you're excluded from because of a conviction, I do think that is effective in different places in California where we have looked at this. It's effective of the reality of being able to get people either jobs or licenses or a clearance. But the other thing, to your point, Charles, is as a incentive, as an encouragement. I think it can. You do have the real piece that Cedric's talking about around a lot of trying to convince employers. And, we have had bonding that's available that hasn't been as much, but it's helpful. Having this type of kind of insurance that DC has is sounds incredibly appealing. But often what we found is employers also want, who am I going to call when he doesn't show up or he comes up, he shows up in a way that's not okay. Right. And I think so that is, we have gotten to the point, like for instance, in Oakland with a particular program that specifically has employment services for people who are formerly incarcerated, even actively on supervision, is we have gotten to the point where almost everybody can get a job. Keeping is another question, right? So we've got to also provide coaching and ongoing support. But yes, Charles, I have found that being able to earn your way up to something like expungement is something that is effective for helping people support that behavior.
And I wanted to say, Charles, too, that there is definitely an evidence base for expungement. But part of what that evidence base also identifies as more of the barrier is people being able to afford the process and also being aware of the process. But there is there is an evidence base, and I do actually, I have a network of prosecutors, the prosecution research network from around the country, with jurisdictions that identify as conservative prosecutors, jurisdictions that identify as progressive prosecutors, and they almost unanimously support expungement as being connected to their deferral programs and diversion programs, and have qualitatively identified them as a very strong incentive and a very important process in their deferral programs.
Yeah,
May I
Mark,
just underscore what Carrie just said, because I just can't stress enough how important I think it is to give people an opportunity to avoid having a criminal record in the first place. So yes, the prosecutors love deferred dispositions. They want to control them, of course, Carrie. That's one of the things. They don't want the court to control them. So they like diversion, but they don't want deferred adjudication necessarily. I would really like to know whether we can persuade the United States Justice Department, which controls things in the federal sector and in DC, at least many types of cases in DC, whether we can persuade the prosecutors here that have been so opposed to almost any kind of relief, particularly sealing relief, whether we could persuade them to expand the federal deferred adjudication statute. I think the courts would love to have this authority, to not have to impose judgment on people, to give people another chance. And there is some research, but it's hard to do because it's hard to get the data, because it's sort of, there's a self-selection in this population. And that's why the Harris County study is so interesting.
okay, one thing I was going to ask you to do for us, Margaret, is to kind of clarify for some people who may not know the technicalities. Because David suggested that even expungement leaves you vulnerable to an internet search. But I mean, how does expungement differ from getting a pardon or having your record sealed? I mean, what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, basically, there are two types of relief. One seeks to limit public access to the record, and terminology is a little slippery here. Sometimes the jurisdiction calls it expungement, and sometimes they call it sealing or annulment or erasure in Connecticut, vacatur in some states. So limiting public access to the record is one way of dealing with a conviction record, so that a background check doesn't necessarily return it. The other way is to have this more transparent notion of certificates of good conduct. And I think that some jurisdictions have had very good luck with them. New York has had a certificate program that does away with legal restrictions. They've had one since the 1940s. And there are a number of other states that now have pretty powerful certificate programs. I have heard people say that employers appreciate two things. Number one, the limitation on liability that Cedric mentioned, although God knows I don't think there are that many negligent hiring suits, but employers like that. They also like to know that some top official, in the case of the federal system, a federal judge has taken a look at a person and said, you have done well. You have really rehabilitated yourself. You've got your show on the road, and I'm prepared to put my name on the bottom of an order ordering you to have this certificate. So there is some evidence that if you elevate the certificate high enough, employers appreciate having that reassurance. And the little final piece of this, which is a little discouraging, there's been some research that suggests that ban-the-box laws may have a counterproductive effect in that they allow some people to assume things about people if they can't tell if they have a record or not. Maybe they assume, some people do, based on racial stereotypes. And I have heard and seen some pretty respectable researchers say that they are concerned that this may also infect a sealing program. That if you're not able to do a background check and show what somebody's background is, you will inevitably discriminate and assume things. So that's one reason. If that's true, I hate to think it is, but if it's true, perhaps having this more transparent, open sort of certification by a judge would give comfort to many employers. It's just a thought, and I know that there's a lot of support for expungement, and there is a hearty argument going on in the reform community as to whether we should take the road of limiting public access to the record or providing greater reassurance publicly. Personally, I think that non-conviction records and misdemeanors should go away completely. I have come to view, but I'm not so sure that we can sell felony expungement in a lot of states. And for that reason, if we can't sell it, we should be looking for some alternatives.
I'd like to get Cedric's reactions to the certificates of rehabilitation.
Well, let me say this. In 2011, in the same battery of bills that Phil Mendelson produced, there was a certificate of good standing piece of legislation that passed the council too. And it was relegated to the mayor's office on returning citizen affairs to promulgate regulations to implement it. And Dave, you may remember Charles Thornton was the head of MORCA at the time. And so Charles undertook a series of meetings with us and others in the returning citizen community to try and talk through a process for implementation. And ultimately what he heard from the returning citizens community is, we don't like it. You know, because the problem with that particular bill was that it didn't afford you relief from anything. It didn't address licensure barriers like up in New York, didn't do that at all. All it said was, you're not under supervision presently, nor are there any warrants for your arrest presently.
Oh, Lord, that's not
so there
right.
was no attestation by the mayor, the council, CSOSA, anybody that you were a good person of good character at all. So the folks basically said, so what value is this in the business community if no employers are going to credit this?
What about
Cedric, what would have happened if you had had a federal judge be the one that issued the certificate?
I think that would have been a better pathway. Even a district, AKA Superior Court, AKA federal judge.
Right.
As well. And as you know, Margaret, we have the IRA legislation here in town where you've got folks being cut loose now after serving 15 or 20 years by a judge who says, based on my review of your record of incarceration, I think you have rehabilitated yourself and ought to be let loose. That is something very controversial. You probably noted that yesterday the council unanimously passed kind of an upgrade of the IRA legislation. But I think that, to answer your question directly, I think that would have greater value than what we have on the books today.
Okay, Carrie, let me bring you in. So we are social workers. What should we be doing more, in terms of addressing these issues?
Yeah, well, social workers, I think in terms of criminal justice, people with criminal justice backgrounds have really focused more on the individual and getting them, job ready, job steady, and, whatever other kinds of things. But I really think social work needs to pay more attention to figuring out how to create opportunities in communities, because with employers, with community centers and churches and schools, because really, I just don't think we're going to move the needle if our communities don't start taking responsibility for people's success with criminal records. And social workers have a lot to offer in terms of training employers or other community institutions on how to work with individuals that have criminal records. Let me just give you one really concrete example. So one of the things that IJRD is working on right now is creating almost like a cultural competency training for employers, second chance hire employers that or hire one employers that are willing to hire individuals with criminal backgrounds, and particularly individuals with incarceration histories. Because it's one thing to open the door and hire somebody. It's another thing to retain and promote individuals that have experienced something that is not a typical human experience, which is being behind bars, and then having stigma associated with that and actual real policy barriers associated with that. Employment becomes a lot more complicated. So let me just give one personal example. We hire many people with felony records, and we had 2 master's level employees with felony records. Because of a glitch in the system, they both did not get paid one paycheck. We had 2 master's level employees, one with a felony record, one without. The individual with the felony record went into an emotional tailspin about how this was going to hurt his reputation. His debtors weren't going to believe him. He wasn't sure what he was going to do. He'd been out for 8 years. The individual that didn't have the felony conviction said, "I'll put it on my credit card." Now, fortunately, I'll put my bills on my credit card. Fortunately, I knew the individual that had the felony conviction for many, many years. So I was able to help him kind of work through the implications of this in a way that did not make him feel like he was going to have to go back to prison because all of his credibility had been ruined. And that's a real employer competence issue that I think is really, really important when you don't have organizations like Cedric's organization that can kind of walk alongside employers. And when we get more and more employment opportunities to individuals with these records. So those are probably more answered than what you wanted, but a few ideas anyway.
So David, can
if I might just
sure.
One additional thing that we are striving to do is to provide some vocational training opportunities to the people under supervision in order to enhance their marketability in this labor market. So we have some partners that provide IT training, culinary trainings, and things of that sort so that people can be more competitive. But that's an investment we as a federal agency are making in the folks under supervision in order to help them be successful. And not every supervision agency does that.
Right. And I imagine that if you could attract some private sector support, that would help too. Expand that program. Right. David, can you talk us a little bit about expungement from a juvenile justice perspective?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, obviously there we're talking about incredibly important. When I was in DC at DRS, DC had probably the strongest confidentiality law. I never thought I would be, fighting for it to be slightly loosened just to do some basic research, not to release like names to the public. But I say that to say, I thought now in my experience and being in several other, jurisdictions, really appreciating the protection, of children and what we do to keep, the reason that we have these legal terms that some people outside of the, inside baseball, like you said, don't understand, like adjudication and disposition. Those terms are there because legally we're saying children are less culpable. They're not, they don't commit crimes, right? They're adjudicated for acts of delinquency. But obviously when you're charged as an adult, so like Title 16 in DC and various laws around the country, when you're charged as an adult, it's the same thing. You might be 14, 15, 16, whatever your state allows, but that stays with you forever, something that you've done as a child. The other thing, and like in California in the year 2000, there was a ballot initiative that was passed. It had like 32 changes. It was a get tough on crime law. Some of which were just now overturning, but one of which was if you get a 707B offense in California, that means serious and violent, then you can never close your juvenile record. Even if you're adjudicated as a youth, as a juvenile, you can never close it. Now we're beginning to close those loopholes and ineffective policies, but it's incredibly important that a young person is able to go into adulthood with a clean slate. And despite whatever challenges, whatever mistakes were made, that they can go into adulthood with clean slate, not still suffering from what happened to them as a child. Obviously, with young people charged as adults, that is a difficult piece of it, and there's different states trying to look at that depending upon the severity of the offense, depending upon the type of rehabilitation. Is still to provide those off ramps to young people so that they can be successful when they come home from incarceration. But expungement is incredibly important. Last thing I'll just say on this, I just want to talk about a very innovative and what so far has been very effective practice in Oakland, California. So my organization has worked with the Oakland Police Department for the last several years to develop a diversion program for young people that we wanted to ensure was not a net widener, meaning if young people were not going to be brought into the system anyway, we don't want them brought to the diversion. They should continue to get the whatever, counseled and released or whatever they were going to get. But for young people who were going to otherwise come in the system, at the point of arrest diversion, so that there's zero system involvement. They don't go to juvenile hall, they don't go to youth detention, they don't go to court, they don't get placed on probation for a certain. And so we had a 2-year negotiation, literally, and we were able to agree upon non-violent, non-serious felony cases could be diverted. We launched in April, funny time to launch given the world, but we launched and we're up to about 30 young people, 28 of whom have been arrested for felonies, some of them for relatively serious felonies, that at the point of arrest, they're immediately diverted to this community process where a group of community members, which are clergy, community leaders, business owners, formerly incarcerated people, victims of crime, sit as a council. They're called the Neighborhood Opportunity and Accountability Board. I first got this idea when I was at DYRS and looking at neighborhoods with high concentrations of people under supervision in DC. But we launched this, and it was still relatively early. It's not even a year in, but we're about 30 young people. Not a single one so far has been rearrested. All are engaged and doing well so far. And something happened that was interesting. We provided an update on how it was going to the police department. And they said, whoa, we never get this. Like, even when we send somebody to the deepest or whatever to the system, we never get a report on how's it going. And it was an interesting experience that we had with the police department, and which encouraged them to continue to provide referrals. And so I give that, while it's not an expungement specific example, it's an example of how you can divert system involvement altogether, right? Into kind of something Margaret was pointing at earlier. And an example of how things, the sky didn't fall because of this, and we were able to quicker and more intensely provide supports to these young people and their family. But again, for young people in particular, and last thing I'll just say is there's a small number of young people who engage in serious and violent behavior, interventions for which there are effective interventions. There certainly includes time not in the community interventions, and we can do a lot better. That being said, we've come a long way in juvenile justice reform over the last 10, 20 years.
Okay, Margaret, I want you to give us a little more. Okay.
I was just going to, sorry, go ahead. I was just going to add just a little bit to that piece on diversion. Were you going to ask me?
I was going to ask you more about the First Defender Act.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Could you give us a little more detail? You talked about it briefly. Can you just give us a little more about that act, and can it be
sure.
expanded, or what should we be thinking in terms of the Hill?
Well, yeah, well, this act, the Federal First Offender Act, dates from 1984. It was the same year that Congress passed the Sentencing Reform Act, and the same year that it repealed the Youth Corrections Act, which was a terrible shame. And that was a real watershed for the federal system. The Federal First Offender Act is very, very narrow. It applies only to people who are prosecuted for drug possession, not very many in the federal system, and with no prior drug conviction. And so it is what they call a deferred adjudication model. The model of the statute is excellent. The problem with it is that it applies only to this tiny, tiny group of people. The model is when someone is charged with, in this case, a drug possession offense, they are brought to court. They do plead guilty, which may be a little problematic, but nonetheless, they do plead. And then they are simply put on probation with no judgment. No sentence is imposed by the court. So there is no conviction. Even though there's a guilty plea, there's no conviction in a formal sense. So this is like the diversion programs that we're talking about that are run by prosecutors, except that the court is in charge. And the court may accept someone into the program upon the recommendation of the prosecutor, but the court's the one that decides whether the person has succeeded or not. And so if there were a way to expand, and also at the end of this whole process, under this current law, you can get your record expunged, and that's the word that they use, but only if the offense occurred when you were under 21. So, like, it's really as narrow as you can.
Okay. So we're running out of time.
Excellent model, Charles. That's my point. Is it's an excellent model.
Right.
And we have a report that this is what I wanted to add to Dave's comments, that we, CCRC issued a report, a national report on all these relief mechanisms. And one of the parts of the report catalogs diversion and deferred adjudication, in particular, court-managed diversion, throughout the country. And they name the states that have got good ones, and they name the states that don't have good ones or that don't have any ones. And so you might want to take a look. It's called Many Roads to Rehabilitation, or not, Reintegration, sorry. And that's our 50-state report, and it's got a whole section on deferred adjudication that is really helpful, and there are a lot of good examples there.
Okay, well, we're running out of time, so I want to give everybody at least a minute for a closing statement. I mean, I thank you all for a wonderful panel. There's so many ideas here that we can build on. So Carrie, Cedric, Margaret, and then David, could you just give us your brief closing thoughts?
I would say, I'll just go first since I was first talking. I would just say that that as community members that want to see our community successful and want to see our nation successful, I think you should put expectations on policymakers, that they use data to make decisions about how to create more opportunities and move beyond just looking at rehabilitating individuals, and look at rehabilitating our institutions in our community settings. Thank you.
I would simply like to say to those out there in the audience that might be employers, when we come to you and ask you to hire one, please just say yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Margaret, closing words?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited about what's going on in the States, and I hope that it will be catching in Congress, in the new administration, and some of these new kinds of legislation, whether it's occupational licensing or deferred adjudication or record sealing. I really hope that Congress can make a lot of progress in this area. It is perhaps one of the few that there will be a real desire to work across the aisle. And for that reason, I think it ought to be very appealing to the new administration.
Thank you. David, look like you get the last.
And I just say quickly, one of the things we haven't talked about is investment or reinvestment as we reduce the footprint of corrections in this, primarily incarceration, but even community corrections in this country. We've got to do much better to invest in the communities hardest hit by crime and violence and poverty. We can't be willing to spend $200,000 a year to incarcerate a young person, but not spend even fractions of that in their community to support their community, their family, and those young people. Same is true for adults. We have to have a lot better community investment in these individuals, but also in their communities. And thank you for this great discussion today, Charles.
Thank you all for a wonderful discussion and many good ideas that hopefully we'll be able to take to our colleagues on the Hill, and maybe we can get some things done during this next Congress and new administration. So this has been recorded and it will be available shortly after its conclusion. I want to thank the Center for Social Development for partnering with us, Chris, on this effort, and we will have more of these discussions forthcoming. Thank you all and have a great day.